3 weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg announced that Meta will spend $72 billion on AI infrastructure in 2025. The company's stock plummeted 11% in a single day, erasing over $200 billion in market value. But here's what nobody's telling you. I've been watching Meta burn money on AI, while their own numbers tell a very different story from what Zuckerberg is selling to Wall Street. And what I've discovered should terrify anyone with money invested in this company. Let me be direct about what happened. Meta isn't just spending billions on AI. They're spending without a clear path to return on that investment. When I buy a business or invest in a company, I ask a simple question: how will this money turn into profit? With Meta's AI strategy, I simply cannot answer that question. And when you can't explain how money comes in, you don't have an investment. You have a financial black hole. Over the past 2 years, Meta has spent more than $100 billion on its technological ambitions. Reality Labs, their metaverse division, has lost $58 billion since 2019. Now Zuckerberg is doubling down on AI with spending that exceeds the GDP of entire countries. The market reacted exactly as I expected: fear. Because investors are finally asking the question they should have asked years ago: where are the profits? Here's what deeply concerns me. Meta is trapped in a snare that I've seen destroy excellent companies over the decades. They're spending like a mature, profitable company while behaving like a startup burning venture capital. They have an advertising business that generates $150 billion a year, but they're cannibalizing those profits to chase technologies that may never pay off. This isn't innovation. This is desperation disguised as vision. Charlie Munger used to tell me that the worst thing that can happen to a business is having too much money when things are going well, because you start making irrational bets. Meta is doing exactly that. They have so much money from the advertising business that they've lost discipline. And when you lose financial discipline in technology, especially in something as uncertain as AI, you're not building the future, you're destroying shareholder value. Now let me tell you what's really happening inside Meta, because the numbers paint a picture that should make any rational investor lose sleep. The company is spending $72 billion on AI this year, but when you look at where that money is going and what it's generating in return, you see a frightening mismatch. They're building open source AI models, giving them away for free, and hoping that somehow this transforms into bigger profits in the advertising business. That's not a strategy. That's expensive hope. Think about this for a moment. Meta released the Llama models for free, complete open source. Anyone can download, modify, and use them without paying Meta a single cent. Zuckerberg argues this will create an ecosystem that benefits the company long term. But I've spent 70 years studying businesses, and let me tell you something fundamental. When you give your product away for free and depend on indirect benefits that may never materialize, you're not building a competitive advantage. You're subsidizing your competitors. Compare this to what OpenAI is doing. They charge for ChatGPT. They charge for APIs. They have a direct revenue model, even if it's unsustainable for the reasons I've discussed before. But at least there's a clear line between spending and revenue. Meta is spending as much as OpenAI, perhaps more, and has no direct AI revenue. Zero. All the return depends on incremental improvements in advertising engagement that are impossible to measure or predict accurately. Here's where it gets even worse. Meta is stuck in an arms race with Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and OpenAI itself. Each of these companies is spending hundreds of billions on AI, but Google has Search, Microsoft has Office and Azure, Amazon has AWS. Each of them has clear ways to monetize AI directly or through existing platforms that people already pay to use. What does Meta have? Facebook and Instagram, where people expect everything to be free, and where adding AI features might actually annoy users instead of pleasing them. Let me give you a concrete example of the problem. Meta is putting AI chatbots on Instagram and Facebook. They're adding image generation features. They're building AI assistants for businesses. All of this sounds impressive until you ask, how many people will pay for this? The answer is practically nobody, because Meta's business model has always been free for users, monetized through ads. So they're spending $72 billion hoping these AI features will somehow make people spend more time on the platforms, see more ads, and generate enough incremental revenue to justify the investment. That's not mathematics. That's wishful thinking. You know what scares me about Meta's situation? I've seen this movie before. In fact, I saw this exact movie with the same company just 2 years ago. In 2021, Zuckerberg renamed the entire company from Facebook to Meta and announced they would spend tens of billions building the metaverse. He said this would be the next major computing platform. Wall Street initially loved the vision. The stock went up. And then reality knocked on the door. Reality Labs, Meta's metaverse division, has burned $58 billion since 2019. $58 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more money than the total market value of Ford, Delta Airlines, and many other Fortune 500 companies. And what did investors get for those $58 billion? Virtual reality headsets that nobody wants to use for more than a few minutes. Empty virtual worlds that look like poorly made video games from the 2000s, and quarterly losses that keep growing with no sign of when or if they'll ever stop. Now, Zuckerberg is making exactly the same play with AI. He's making an existential bet on a technology without first proving it can generate returns. He's spending as if he's already won, when in reality he's just entering an extremely expensive race against better positioned competitors. And most worrying is that he's using the massive profits from the advertising business to finance these bets, exactly as he did with the metaverse. Here's the critical difference investors need to understand. When Google spends on AI, they can integrate it directly into search that generates $200 billion a year. When Microsoft spends, they put it in Office that billions of people pay to use. When Amazon spends, it goes to AWS that companies worldwide depend on. But when Meta spends on AI, where does it go? To features they hope will make you click on one more ad on Instagram. The math simply doesn't add up. Let me tell you about a conversation I had years ago with Charlie about technology. He told me that the hallmark of bad management is continuing to do the same thing that didn't work, just bigger and more expensive. Meta lost $58 billion on the metaverse without a clear path to profit. Now they're spending $72 billion a year on AI without a clear path to profit. If that's not the definition of managerial insanity, I don't know what is. And shareholders are finally waking up to this reality, as we saw when the stock plunged $200 billion in value after the announcement. Let me show you the specific numbers that should be keeping Meta investors awake at night. Because when you actually analyze the mathematics, the story becomes even more frightening. Meta generated approximately $150 billion in advertising revenue in 2024. Their total operating costs, including the $72 billion for AI and the ongoing billions lost on the metaverse, are growing faster than revenue. For the first time in years, we're seeing margin compression on a scale that suggests the fundamental business model is under serious pressure. Here's a simple calculation I did in my notebook in Omaha. If Meta spends $72 billion on AI this year and needs a 15% return on that capital to justify the investment, they need to generate $10.8 billion in incremental annual profit just to break even. To achieve that with advertising, assuming a 30% profit margin, they'd need $36 billion in new ad revenue. That represents a 24% increase in total advertising revenue from AI features that most users didn't even ask for and many actively dislike. Now compare that to what's actually happening in the digital advertising market. Growth is slowing. Competition from TikTok is intensifying. Regulators around the world are limiting tracking practices that made Meta's advertising so profitable. And Apple itself, with its iOS privacy changes, has already cost Meta billions in lost ad revenue. So Meta is betting $72 billion a year on a scenario where they need massive revenue growth in a market that's getting harder, not easier. There's also the accounting problem that my friend Michael Burry recently pointed out about tech companies. Meta, like other big techs, is extending the depreciation schedules of their servers and AI infrastructure. They changed the useful life from 4 years to 5.5 years. This may seem technical and boring, but it's crucial. By extending depreciation, they're reporting bigger profits today while pushing the real costs into the future. It's completely legal, but it's misleading. The profits Wall Street is seeing aren't as real as they appear. When you adjust for normal depreciation and account for actual capital spending, Meta is essentially betting the entire company's future profitability on the hope that AI will somehow transform their advertising business. But here's the fundamental problem nobody's discussing. What if AI doesn't significantly improve ad engagement? What if users simply don't care about chatbots on Instagram? What if all this expensive infrastructure just becomes a massive fixed cost that depresses margins for years without generating the promised returns? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are the same questions that should have been asked about the metaverse before burning $58 billion. Throughout my 7 decades of investing, I've seen this pattern repeat countless times. Companies with excellent, profitable core businesses decide they need to be in the next big thing. They start spending enormous amounts of money chasing that vision. And almost always, these bets end in disaster because they confuse transformative technology with profitable investments. Let me tell you about Sun Microsystems, because the story is eerily similar to what we're seeing with Meta today. Sun was an incredible company in the 1990s. They sold Unix servers, had brilliant proprietary technology, and were valued at $200 billion at their peak. But then came Linux, free and open source. Sun kept spending billions developing their proprietary technology while the market moved to free alternatives. A decade later, Oracle bought Sun for just $7 billion. $200 billion became $7 billion because the company couldn't adapt its spending strategy to the market's new reality. Meta is making a similar mistake, but in a different way. They're giving away their AI models for free while spending as if they were selling premium software. They're competing against companies that have clear monetization paths while hoping indirect benefits will magically materialize. And history shows us repeatedly that when you have the combination of massive spending without direct revenue and an intense competition from better positioned players, you're building on quicksand. Think also about the telecommunications boom of the late 1990s. Companies spent $500 billion laying fiber optic cable because everyone was convinced the internet would change everything. And they were right about the internet, but they were completely wrong about the timing and scale. By 2002, only 5% of installed fiber was being used. The rest sat in what the industry called dark fiber. Companies like Global Crossing and WorldCom went bankrupt. Shareholders lost everything. The technology was real, but the spending was irrational. Meta's situation with AI has all the characteristics of that telecommunications disaster. Multiple companies building at the same time, extrapolating growth curves into the future, assuming they'll capture large market shares, underestimating competition, and overestimating near-term demand. The difference is that this time it's not just telecom companies. It's the world's largest technology companies, all simultaneously spending hundreds of billions in an arms race that someone will inevitably lose. And my analysis strongly suggests that Meta, with its open source model without direct revenue, is in a particularly vulnerable position. So here we are. Meta is spending $72 billion a year on AI without a clear path to monetization. They've already burned $58 billion on the metaverse with nothing significant to show for it. Margins are being compressed. The advertising market is getting harder, and Zuckerberg is doubling down exactly as he did with the metaverse, using the same arguments about building the future and staying ahead of the curve. The market reacted by removing $200 billion in market value in a single day. And honestly, I think that was the rational reaction. Let me be absolutely clear about what I would do if I were considering investing in Meta today. I would pass. Not because AI isn't important, not because Meta doesn't have a talented engineering team, but because the fundamentals of a good investment simply aren't present. When you can't draw a clear line between money spent and money earned, when you're betting on indirect benefits that might take years to materialize, if they ever do, you're not investing. You're speculating, and speculating with $72 billion a year rarely ends well. The difference between a company like Meta and a solid investment is simple. Take Coca-Cola, a company I've owned for decades. When Coca-Cola spends money on a new factory or marketing, I can calculate the return. More factories mean more bottles sold. More marketing means more brand recognition and more sales. It's straightforward. With Meta spending on open source AI, what's the calculation? They hope it improves engagement, which might lead to more time on platforms, which might result in more ad impressions, which might generate incremental revenue. That's not an investment thesis. That's a chain of hopes. Charlie used to say that the big money is made by waiting. Waiting for fat pitches. Waiting for opportunities where the odds are clearly in your favor. Meta is not that opportunity, especially not now after the AI spending. It's a speculation disguised as an investment. And when Google is already beating you on day one with Gemini, when Microsoft has Office and Azure, when Amazon has AWS, and you're giving your product away for free hoping for indirect returns, the odds simply aren't in your favor. My advice is simple. If you own Meta stock, ask yourself why. If the answer is because you believe AI spending will eventually pay off, you need evidence for that belief, not just hope. If the answer is because you think the advertising business is strong enough to absorb these losses indefinitely, look at the compressed margins and ask how long that's sustainable. And if the answer is because you trust Zuckerberg's vision, remember that this same vision burned $58 billion on the metaverse without results. Meta is losing its way. The numbers don't lie. And when a company with an excellent core business starts cannibalizing it to chase increasingly expensive bets on unproven technologies, history shows us that shareholders are the ones who pay the price. Don't let that shareholder be you.